This is the Kea Research Podcast. Our podcast helps to bring you analyst insights from sages within the industry and from analyst relations leaders. Here's your host, Duncan Chapple, researcher and managing partner at Kea Research.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's session. For those of you who are just joining us, we're going to be speaking today about going beyond best practice analyst relations. I'd like to introduce Teri Green. She's recently retired from AR at PwC, where she worked with the cyber and risk side of the business. She's a longtime AR expert and has been in the field for about 15 years. Also speaking today will be Duncan Chapple. He's the research director for the Analyst Attitude Survey, and he's been doing that since about 2002. He's located in Edinburgh, and he's a former Ovum analyst. And finally, my name is Stephen Miller. I'm a client partner for the Kea Company, and after we acquired Sage Circle, I've been helping customers in the USA. First speaking is going to be Duncan. He's going to be talking about going beyond best practice.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon maybe. Thank you so much for joining us today in picking up on the discussion about firstly the notion of best practice, and then what does it mean to go beyond best practice when best practice itself seems like such a difficult thing to aspire for. And in today's webinar, we'll be going through 6 ideas. Firstly, starting from the idea that best practice is something that exists in the analyst relations community. There's a commonly held idea about what it means to shape analysts' perception. And over the last 20 years, at least, IBM, Cisco, other firms have really set the bar for what that means. But what we'll be talking about, both for Teri from her experience and myself from the research that we're doing into analyst relations, what we're going to talk about is the way that some organizations have gone beyond that. They're not just at the level of generally held best practice, but they're exceeding that. And what Teri will go into is not just how these organizations have done it, what this best practice looks like, but also what the obstacles are. What are the things that are preventing people from attaining best practice and from exceeding it? And then towards the end of the webinar, we'll be talking about the obstacles to overcoming these. What are the things that you need to be aware of as you move towards best practice? And then finally, we'll be drawing together some ideas about moving forward, partly how we can help you to move forward, but also how you can mobilize resources in your own organization to move forward. And I'd like to start off by just picking up on something that actually surprised me when I started looking into the idea of best practice. Because initially I thought that best practice was just the best way of doing something. And it turns out that actually best practice is a little bit more nuanced than that. Best practice is the accepted, prescribed standard for how you do something. So best practice isn't just the best way of doing something, it's something that is widely accepted and prescribed as being the best way of doing something. So I looked, unsurprisingly, at Gartner's definition of best practice, and Gartner talks about best practice as being a way of optimizing your efficiency or your effectiveness. And if you think about it that way, it means that it would be quite easy for an organization to get out ahead of best practice by just being more efficient or being more effective. But actually, best practice is something a little bit different from that. It's not just being good, it's following things that are generally held to be good. And when we look back at this idea of what best practice is in the analyst relations community, actually there are some assumptions which have been pretty much stable over the dozen or more years that Teri, many of the people on this call have been working around the analyst relations community. We've seen in many organizations the assumption that your organization probably knows the analysts that matter, that you influence them through organizing events, that you measure your success by looking at the content that they produce, that you should be reporting to marketing communications, and you should be funded by corporate marketing. I think that's the common sense that you see through the analyst relations community. And I think those ideas have been more or less stable, even if you look back 10 or 20 years. I looked back in my records to a workshop I organized in 2005 for a group of these powerhouse vendors that lead the analyst relations community. And actually, when I was comparing a few of the firms that gave the most data to this workshop back in 2005, what I could see that actually, in terms of their model of analyst relations being very much based around events, briefings, face-to-face briefings, analyst days, telephone briefings, it being measured by the kind of valuable content that you're able to generate to marketing and sales, the way that you should be organized as part of the marketing function, trying to align to the business, the way that marketing does, the way that the primary challenge in a way was getting the balance right between being active and being reactive and being proactive, the way that reporting had to be primarily done to marketing, and the way in which targeting was done basically by our organization's perception of who was influencing clients. Actually, best practice was very consistent across those firms in 2005, and it hasn't really changed very much since then in most of the firms that we are talking to. What I'm going to do now is just hand over to Teri, who will talk more about the obstacles and the opportunities while I try to focus on pressing the down button at the right time.
Well, good morning, afternoon or evening, kind of depending upon where you are. Thank you, Duncan and Stephen, for your introductions. Very nice. Very happy to speak with you today. Hopefully you'll come away with, 2 or 3 good ideas to try. So let's go ahead and get started. No matter how sound your AR program is, there's still some nasty obstacles that get in your way. And by identifying them early, we can really set a solid foundation for moving forward. So let's talk about them in 3 areas: goals, strategy, and execution. One of the big obstacles is a poor understanding of the industry analyst ecosystem. And what do I mean by that? I mean poor identification of which analysts are the most influential, poor understanding of what the analyst really wants or needs from a vendor, what they're looking for out of interacting with you, and mistakenly the one-sided strategy that activity, we've all been there, right? Briefings, analyst meetings, inquiries, even analyst days denotes a successful program plan. The obstacles for strategy are really critical at this juncture. It's poor alignment of AR goals to company goals. Think about that for a second and try to envision if that's something that you've even talked about or kind of put in any type of plan that you might have. Poor or no education to executives or sales teams. Really critical to be able to do this. Poor internal spokespeople. How many times have we been on an inquiry or a briefing? A spokesperson says something, they haven't been prepped, they don't understand the analyst viewpoint, they haven't read anything that the analyst has put out, and you go, oh my gosh, okay, that was not good. Poor follow through. And I'll be talking about that later, really critical. And the assumption, and this is a big one as well, and we're all in this today, the assumption that the company must respond to each and all report requests. So these major analyst evaluations, right? Forrester's said that they're doing 20% more this year. We all know Forrester, Gartner, IDC are doing more of them, and they're painful, and there's a lot of them. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then obstacles to execution. Execution is really important as well. Are we spending too much time on less important analysts? Or are we spending too much time on analysts that we can't really shift? Might be extremely influential, but really set in their ways, right? Analysts are getting overlooked, especially on the demand side, or non-US analysts. There might be an analyst in Sweden that's covering your marketplace and is highly influential, and you're just not talking to them. Or we've all been here. We do it every day. We're spending way too much time on tactical activities. That's a big one. So let's move on to really trying to get beyond best practice. How are we overcoming these obstacles? So let's talk about goals that are tailored to your business goals. Are you doing due diligence and researching the right influential firms, not only the analysts, but the right influential firms? Do you understand what that ecosystem looks like? What maybe tiny little firms that maybe a Gartner or Forrester analyst move to that are going to be very influential? Are you tiering them? These are something that I think a lot of AR professionals do. But do you revisit this? Do you go back twice a year and make sure that you're still doing the right things with the right analysts? And having a vision for how these relationships can be force multipliers. I love that word, force multipliers, because that's exactly what they are. So which analysts are the most influential in your market? Which analysts are overlooked and maybe the easiest to sway, right? Here's a little story. So you find out that there's a new analyst at Forrester or Gartner coming in to the company for the first time, and they're squarely in your sweet spot, squarely within your market, within your solution set. Get to that analyst early. Get an inquiry set up with them as early as you can, and start developing a long-term relationship with them. Get them in front of executives. Get really excited about the things that you're doing so that you are foremost in their mind because they've been talking to you a lot and you got to them very early. Really good beyond best practice. Which analysts are open-minded and don't hate you, right? There are analysts out there that for whatever reason, long time attitude that they just have some issues with, some of the bigger companies and maybe even some of the smaller companies that didn't get off to a good start. Here's another tip. Ask an analyst. If you were me, knowing what you know about my solution, my company, what we're trying to achieve, who should I be talking to within Forrester, Gartner, IDC, HFS? Which one of your peers should I be talking to? And if you can even go a little bit farther, ask them to rate those analysts. Really good best practice, beyond best practice. Also, don't forget social media, right? Some of the analysts do great at social media, some do not. But if social media is a goal of yours, then you need to work it every day. And working it every day means you need to work it as in, tweeting or blogging, but you also need to be paying attention to what they're doing in social media as well. And here's a beyond best practice, a really good tip. Use your account executive. Establishing a stellar relationship with your account executive, whether you like them or not, is very invaluable because they can really help you. If they like you and they really understand your business, and again, that's really prepping them so that they understand your business, they can be invaluable to what you're trying to achieve. So let's talk about strategy that's shared with your stakeholders. What is your vision for the Analyst Relations Program? Who's actually put that down in writing? This is my vision. These are my specific goals and expectations, and they're doable. They're feasible. Drive relationship building with the right analysts and the right executives. I'm a firm believer in relationship building, analyst relations. Establish metrics around these relationships. So relationship building is, another little story here is you can put together the greatest analyst day. You can have 50 analysts in the room talking to all your executives, but that one time that you had a lunch with one of your executives or subject matter experts or your CTO or your CMO, and it was a long lunch, they got along famously, they really liked each other, they decided to talk on a consistent basis. drives so much more brand and revenue and value for your company than maybe that 50-person analyst day that you spent 6 months, trying to put on the books. Gain commitment from the most influential executives that AR is a priority, really critical, really important as well. This is not just your manager. Establish an advocate within the executive ranks. Again, maybe the CTO, the VP of sales, that will fight for you in the role, that says analyst relations is critical to our business. It drives sales. It drives brand. I want my people to be engaged with the analyst relations team all the time. Make sure your executives understand the value proposition of industry analyst relations. So that means getting in front of them and maybe doing a presentation and showing them success metrics and how you've been able to drive things. Because without that value proposition and the executives understanding that, we all know companies that have had to cut costs and cut people, and you don't want analyst relations to be the first place that they do that. And remember that analysts are clients too. You have to ingrain this in your executives. You can't let them cancel analyst meetings the day before or 2 hours before. They wouldn't do that to a client. They shouldn't do that to an analyst. So remember, as an AR professional, that your clients are analysts. Treat them as account executives treat their clients. Perfect. So now, maniacal focused execution. So you're designing a strategic AR plan, one that's proactive for each firm. You've got a plan for Gartner, you've got a plan for Forrester, you've got a plan for IDC, whichever firms you're engaging with. You've sat down with the firm's account manager, you've gone through that with them. By the way, they love this because it shows just, huge proactive strategic thinking on your part that drives critical areas of communication and education internally and externally. So make sure that your plan is driving the things that you want to happen internally within your company, marketing team, executives, technical folks, and externally to the firms and the analysts. Create a communication plan for internal stakeholders. I love inquiry. Inquiry is your silver bullet. Getting in front of analysts as often as possible on the phone, having a purpose, being relevant, but inquiry can be very invaluable. Engage your sales teams, educate them, become a valuable resource, help them close business, sit on their monthly, weekly calls. Sometimes you don't say anything. Sometimes you say, hey, there's this great piece of research you should read. Or, hey, I think I know that Forrester is in this account. Maybe I can call them and get some intelligence. And when talking about major account evaluations, it's really critical that you don't do all the work. Establish an internal SWAT team of subject matter experts that are accountable. And that's really important too. They understand that at the end of the day, whatever that eventual outcome was, it's not on your shoulders, it's on their shoulders. You guide them, you project manage them, but they are the ones that are accountable, and they are the ones that are taking time out of their really busy schedule to make sure that they're doing all the right things. And establish a strategy that identifies which reports are a must-do. Really, do you have to do all of them that they ask you to do? Are there some that maybe are not going to hurt your sales strategy, they're not going to hurt your brand strategy, that you just really don't need to spend the time in doing? So make sure that you evaluate each and every one of them. And another beyond best practice, establishing a solid customer reference program is really, really important. This is a reference program that you have already set up. Someone needs to own this because they need to consistently update it, but it's where you can go to and find those referenceable clients that are going to talk very positively about you, and you've got them at your fingertips. So you don't need to chase at midnight a sales executive and say, please, please, please let me talk to your client. And then you don't have time to prep the client, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So ongoing development of the plan. These are kind of like AR 101, but there's so many people that forget this stuff. Are you pre-briefing your internal stakeholders, even if it's an inquiry call? Obviously you are if it's a briefing, but every time somebody's talking to an analyst, you should be spending at least 5 minutes or 10 minutes before the call or a day before the call, getting everybody on the same page and making sure that everything's aligned and they know what to say and what not to say. They've got the analyst research in front of them. They've read it. They can talk to it. As you know, analysts love that. Debrief after the calls. Immediately after the call, get back on the phone and say, how did that go? What did we do wrong? What did we do right? This is another thing. Meet analysts face-to-face as often as possible. What I always tried to do is I always tried to go into Forrester, go into IDC once a quarter. I'd call up my account executive and I'd say, I'm coming into town on the 10th. How many analysts can I get in front of in the office? How many analysts are going to be in the office that'll give me 20 or 30 minutes? And I always usually got 4 or 5 meetings. And even though they weren't very long, it was critical in establishing relationships. Make sure you have some relevant information to talk to them about. You've got some white papers, you can tell them about a new solution, and then follow up, follow up, follow up. Don't be afraid to toot your own horn. There's always a fine balance here, but if you're not talking about your successes and they're not seeing them, you're really doing your team a disservice. Make sure it's framed as value back to sales or value back to the brand as well. Be maniacal about the plan. Make sure that there are metrics that are attached to every single step along the way. And by metrics, I mean numbers. Put numbers, attach numbers to things. Track them every month. Think about designing an infographic, a really quick graphic that you can push out quarterly that shows not only the amount of activity, but the successes that you've had. And then consider sending client wins in the form of a case study to your most important analysts. Call them up and say, hey, do you want to discuss more about this client win that we did? I think it'd be really valuable because we did some really unique stuff. So don't be afraid to do that as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to Duncan, and he can talk a little bit further about beyond best practice.
Thanks so much, Teri. That was really instructive experience being crystallized there. What I want to do now is to introduce this idea that we have of the winner's oval, and I want to explain, why is it that some analyst relations teams are kind of winning, producing a new frontier for excellence, and then also try to outline that there are some activities that actually any firm could do, any analyst relations team with any kind of resources could do to outperform their competitors. And the core idea is really this, that when we think about this traditional idea of best practice, this core analyst relations activity, these are the sorts of things that are in the column on the left-hand side. So it's about identifying the analysts, about interacting with them, and then when analysts produce something that's useful, then you push that out to your colleagues in marketing and sales. And obviously it's hard to do those things right. But, as Teri has indicated, there are a whole series of best practices from building better rapport with account executives in the analyst firms, through to making sure that your subject matter experts better understand the analysts. That can really transform the way in which analyst relations teams are performing. When we look at the analyst relations teams that perform best using our analyst attitude survey, we're able to use the responses of several hundred analysts that comment on the major analyst relations teams. And we're able to see what are the organizations that are doing best, doing differently. And what we see is that there are these two areas here. There's driving analysts' use by executives and driving value to sales. These things are being done differently by the organizations which are performing most effectively. So they're monitoring analysts' opinions, building different kinds of relationships with analysts, not just pushing information to them, about building partnerships with them, engaging in real dialogue with them, trying to broaden out the relationships between analysts and the stakeholders and subject matter experts inside their organizations. They're understanding the analyst value that's being generated for the firm, so understanding the value of the insight that the organization is getting from analysts, understanding the value of the recommendations of industry analysts, and they are strategically sizing up the analyst value that the program is generating at the moment and seeing how to increase it. And then they're monitoring and measuring the depth of the use of analysts, the relationships, the consumption of research, and so on. And then we're also seeing that these analyst relations teams have been most successful if they're able to also direct more value into the sales organization. Obviously, if you're able to get executives to use analysts more, and if you're able to get sales to get more value from analysts, you're increasing corporate buy-in, you're increasing the internal support for analyst relations. But you're able to also really drive substantial value to the sales organization. You need foundations for this to be able to monitor analysts' opinions, so you can tell sales when analysts have said things that are useful. And sales needs to be trained in advance to know how to leverage analysts' value propositions, how to leverage analyst firms' specific value propositions. And with those foundations, you can build a more active partnership between analyst relations and sales. And it means that when you're proactively pushing information out into the sales organization, it's going to be used. And you can monitor and measure the value of the insight that you're delivering to sales. And as I mentioned, in our analyst attitude survey, we're able to really quantify this and to see what it means in analyst relations performance. So this is a chart which, well, like most charts, requires a little bit of explanation. Each of the dots on this chart is an analyst relations team inside a large vendor, and they are ranked from zero place, but I suppose really it's from first place. Nobody's in zero place. They're ranked from being first place to 50th place for activity, and first place to 50th place for outcomes. And what this trend line shows, rather unsurprisingly, is that the more activity you're putting in, broadly speaking, your outcomes are going to be better. But there's a rather gentle correlation between those two things. And actually, what I've picked out on this chart are two groups of outliers. Firstly, there are firms inside the winner's oval. So these organizations that are very high for outcomes, but actually their level of activity they're not in the top 10 for activity, but they are in the top for the outcomes and the benefits that their organizations are generating from analyst relations. These organizations are punching above their weight. And then the flip side is also true. Of course, there are some firms which are on autopilot. They're ranked very high for activity. They're reaching out to analysts, they're booking the right appointments, they're consuming a large amount of analysts' time. But in exchange for that, they're not really generating exceptionally high outcomes. And these organizations maybe it's a little unfair to say that they're on autopilot, but certainly they're not able to generate the kinds of outcomes that you would expect from a high level of activity. So what we're seeing is that there are lots of organizations that have got high activity, and really that's what best practice is about. It's about booking events. It's about making sure you're taking up a lot of analyst time. There are even analyst relations programs that measure themselves in terms of volume of time that they consume in analysts' calendars. But there are organizations that are putting in less that are achieving much more. We've worked with some of these firms that are performing at a much higher level than the resources that they're putting into analyst relations would expect. And the process that they stepped through, in a way, picks up many of the questions that Teri has asked, that analyst relations professionals would encourage their organizations to address, but then puts them into a structural process that helps organizations to move up to best practice. That's a challenge in itself. and then to move beyond best practice. And what we find is that organizations have to start off with an audit. There has to be a conscious activity where organizations are marshalling insight to understand what their strategies are for analyst relations and how effectively they seem to be doing that at the moment. So instead of assuming that your targeting is right because your salespeople should know all the right analysts and they'll be open to you to telling you that, you need to ask questions more critically. How effectively are you targeting? Instead of assuming that by simply meeting analysts, you are meeting an analyst's needs, you need to be asking, well, actually, are we meeting this analyst's needs? And for each of the key analysts in your account plan, you need to be asking individually, how far are we meeting that analyst's needs? And then when we look at the information that we're sharing, of course, there's information that organizations voluntarily understand, proactively want to share with analyst organizations. But then, of course, it's also the case that there might be other information that analysts want to get from vendor organizations that they may not be getting. And it's important to ask, are we giving analysts all the information they need to be able to recommend us to buyers? But that audit by itself gives us insight, but it doesn't produce results necessarily. Organizations need to go through a further stage of active alignment in order to make sure that we've got alignment inside the analyst relations teams, especially inside large organizations where there might be parallel analyst relations teams inside different parts of the business, or where the analyst relations team might be composed of different professionals with slightly different attitudes towards building relationships. It may be not a trivial activity to try to align the organization, both in terms of making sure stakeholders are aligned to what the analyst relations team and to making sure people in the analyst relations program are themselves aligned. A big part of that means focusing on the most important things. And bottlenecks are really important. Sometimes there can be so many things wrong, so many opportunities for improvement, people might not know where to start. And what this audit process allows organizations to do is to see actually what are the narrowest points in the process? Where are the things where you are falling short and preventing the different benefits that you have inside your program from multiplying fully with each other to give you maximum impact? So we're able to take this process, looking at what you are doing now, and to show how far the different elements in the process relate to each other, and to show how far your relationships with stakeholders need to improve and how far your processes need to improve. Out of that, you can create a step-by-step plan, not just about how to resolve these challenges, but what you need to do to get up to best practice, and then what you need to do to go beyond best practice. And something that many organizations have found useful, especially in larger analyst relations teams where there might not be full alignment between the professionals, is to think about certification from the Institute for Industry Analyst Relations. One of the nice things about the IAAR's certification approach is that it forces people to have a concrete conversation about what best practice means. And the process of going through certification, especially the different levels of certification, also means making sure that people have got not just the foundations, but they're also developing a kind of shared common idea about the kinds of outcomes that they want to generate. And then finally, we have the need to implement. As Teri said, an obsessive, maniacal focus on implementing the plan is an absolutely key activity. We need follow-up plans, we need to identify opportunities, and we need to kind of make people in the team responsible for these opportunities. It helps to deliver the plan as a detailed report so that you can hold stakeholders accountable. You know, if you need more candid spokespeople, it really helps if that was kind of the contract that you've written down, part of the charter that you've given yourselves as a team as part of the process of achieving best practice. But also it helps us to agree on what we're going to recommend. Often it can help us also to justify the things that we're going to forego. Maybe we're going to not speak to markets quite so often in order to spend a little bit more time with some more influential analyst firm. And it also suggests a timeline, because absolutely we can't do everything straight away. We have to focus on the bottlenecks, but then not lose sight of what we want to accomplish in the short term and in the medium term. And obviously, Kea Company has a lot of experience in working with teams, helping them to go through this best practice. And we'd be delighted to talk to anyone about the process that we have of how organizations are able to use our audits to build development workshops that help teams to align, and then how ongoing support for implementation has helped some of these organizations that we've worked with to really move beyond best practice as quickly and effectively as possible. I'm going to turn back to Teri now, and we'll hear her kind of drawing together some of these themes for us.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. So in summary, I think we've heard a lot of things around building blocks. We've learned that we need to focus on specific things that are going to drive the business forward, that are going to help drive brand, help drive sales. We've seen hopefully some new ideas that you hadn't thought of before, of ways of advancing your program. And I have a challenge for you. So if you feel that your program isn't moving as quickly as you'd like, or you feel you're kind of stuck in the doldrums and you want to figure out something that's unique or that drives your program quicker, I would challenge you to identify your top 3 analysts. Focus on those 3 analysts and put together a communication plan for each one of them. A very detailed communication plan that says, and I'd start with an inquiry. I'd get all 3 of them on a call, just you and the analyst, and say, how can I help you? How can I help you, Mr. or Mrs. Analyst, in your upcoming research, in driving new solutions, in finding customer case studies? What can I do? And hopefully through that discussion, you'll identify areas where you can pull executives in to create those deeper relationships. You can pull your technical people in to show them the really unique things that you're doing. And you can go deeper in specific areas. Maybe you have placed big bets on a couple of new solution areas, or new markets, or new ways of thinking. Maybe you're doing some great AI stuff, or a little story that I can tell at a company that I was with was we had kind of moved into this new area. We'd kind of dipped our toe into it and had some pretty good success with it. And we were talking to an analyst that kind of had a little bit of a focus on it because it was an emerging technology. And they said, would you ever be open to acquiring a company that does just this? And we said, absolutely, we would. We'd like to hear more about that. Well, long story short, we ended up acquiring a small company that the analyst had reached out to us and told us about. And so that really solidified that analyst relations was adding huge value to the company and what the company was doing. So don't be afraid to go out of your comfort zone. Ask questions. Go in tiny little places. Always connecting the dots. If there's something that an analyst wants to talk about and you just happen to talk to a person in your company that's focused on blockchain, pull those people together as soon as you can, because that analyst now knows you've got an expert and they can tell their next client, hey, maybe we need to be talking to this client, this company, because they've got experts in these, specific areas. So that's just, kind of a challenge that I would put out to you. I think at this point, I don't have anything else. Duncan, did we want to kind of open it up for questions?
Absolutely, yes, we did. I think Stephen is standing by, looking to see if any questions come into the chat bar.
Yeah, we can field questions in the chat, or we can also direct emails to my email at steven.miller@keacompany.com.
Or go off mute and ask a question.
Hi, I don't know if you guys can hear me. I've never tried speaking over my computer before.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. This is Tracy King. I'm with Verizon. Thanks both for the presentation. I feel like we've got a pretty robust analyst relations program here, but I always like to pick up new. And I was really interested in the slide on where you were rating 50 AR teams, and I'm just curious who kind of floats to the top, or could you go into a little bit more detail on what's involved in that winner's oval, why you view those teams as the way that you do, and did you evaluate Verizon, and where do we fall? If it's not good, you can tell me afterwards, not in front of everyone else on the call.
Yeah, we did evaluate Verizon, but I must say I can't immediately remember which of these dots is Verizon. I mean, except that I know it's not one of the ones in the top right hand corner. What we're doing in our analyst attitude survey, which we've run since about 2002, so we've got a lot of data there, is we're asking analysts two sets of questions. But firstly, we're asking them about the level of interaction that they have with analyst relations teams. And that's what this score for activity is. So we're asking lots of different questions about the activity that analyst relations teams are engaging these analysts in. We've averaged these different activity-related questions out. They've all got numerical scores, and we've ranked the firms from highest over on the right-hand side to lowest over on the left-hand side. And so the firms in the winners oval are all putting in, a fair amount of effort, but they're not trying to boil the ocean. They're not putting in a huge amount of effort. But then in the other question, when we look at outcomes, we're asking questions like, do you trust these people, or would you recommend them onto shortlists? What do your customers tell you about these firms? Things which are not really related to analyst relations, but are related to the perception of the brand and how likely these firms are to be recommended by the analysts. We can see that it's possible for these organizations in the winner oval to have, a fair level of activity, but maybe not a world-class level of activity. But they can get world-class outcomes. So they're ranked very high for outcomes and not so high for activity. But then we can see the other way around, that actually many of the organizations, maybe even most of the organizations with a very high level of activity, actually are doing nowhere near as well as we would expect in terms of outcomes. And I think that's because they've got this best practice idea, which is organizing meetings and consuming as much analysts' time as possible, but not necessarily being able to shift the way that these analysts are perceiving the brand.
Thank you.
Hey, Teri and Duncan, it's Rick. Quick question. Oftentimes executives can be a little bit skeptical of a program. Do you have any examples of where you've taken sort of a skeptical executive and sort of turned them into a believer of the program? Any tips or tricks there?
I have one trick that just happened to me at PwC, and that was during my analyst day. I had an analyst that had been speaking to me about how she felt that the analyst relations program within specific companies could be very valuable if it had been done effectively, and she hadn't seen it done effectively very often, and she wanted to communicate how she thought that PwC or any other large consulting firm could effectively work with her. So I pulled my executive aside. They sat down for about an hour, and she was very straightforward and what's the word I'm looking for? Very candid about how an analyst relations program could be very valuable if done effectively. And he walked away. He was kind of on board, not really on board. He walked away, and she gave specific examples. And he walked away from that meeting completely turned around. So don't be afraid if you've got a really good relationship with an analyst and they firmly believe in an analyst relations program, that you get them down face to face in front of a customer or in front of an executive and kind of talk through how they've seen the effectiveness of analyst relations.
I think just to add to that, I think there are some ways that I've seen, especially with smaller firms. One of the things to addresses that there's a big pay-to-play perception, especially in people in small and mid-sized firms. And that can be really hard to pick up with, because lots of firms have only encountered Gartner through meeting Gartner salespeople. And so if the only people you speak to at Gartner, then absolutely you are going to get the impression from Gartner salespeople that spending more money with Gartner is going to be a good thing for you and for your business. And what I found powerful has been to use things like the analyst attitude, to use things like the analyst value survey, where we show, this very wide range of analysts that are being used by buyers in a very wide range of industries. It's not just one or two analysts who are being used in small numbers of situations. Analyst influence is very broad, very diffuse, actually more diffuse than it ever was. And so pointing to facts really helps. Actually, in larger organizations, it becomes so simple because you just need 1, 2, 3 sales where you can show that working with analysts has helped you to broaden the pipeline, let alone to close a deal. And then I think in most organizations, you just need 1 extra sale, and that closes the conversation forever.
Yeah, exactly. I think there might have been another question.
Yeah, hi there, guys. It's Rob Mapp. Thanks for the great content. It's really good. It's a great refresher in some points, and then sort of gets me to think in some others. I also have a question about the attitude survey, and I'm just wondering how it accounts for scale of the program. So, for example, like your Amazon and Microsoft and others are quite large in terms of scale of AR professionals. Does that survey also account for the best of breed vendors or startup vendors?
There's definitely an issue with data sufficiency for some firms. So in the survey, we're focused on the 50 largest organizations. And these are ones where we have enough data sufficiency to be able to have meaningful regional breakdowns. Yes, so most of our clients want to be able to compare, the USA against Asia, to compare North America rather against Asia Pacific, for example. So with these 50 biggest firms, we have no problem in having really meaningful data sufficiency. What we do is we ask analysts. Analysts get a switchboard when they come into the survey. There are 50 names, 48 names, something like that. And analysts can pick up to 10 that they comment on the most. So the analysts are only commenting on the firms that are highly relevant for them. And absolutely, we do have organizations that might have quite small numbers, relatively small numbers of analysts commenting on them. But what we're showing on this chart isn't the sum of these scores, it's the average of these scores. Yeah? So it could be the case that the 50th smallest firm, or the 50th biggest firm, could be having an absolutely high level of activity with the analyst it's focused on. And those analysts could recommend it with great confidence. And then that organization would be up in the top right hand corner. So the way that we're charting using averages does kind of get rid of the size effect to a degree. But obviously, the bigger your analyst relations program, the better it's probably going to be.
Great, thank you.
I have one other quick beyond best practice that I'll talk about just really quickly that might kind of spark some interest in folks, especially those that are with bigger companies. Bigger companies tend to have very robust, great AR programs. They have to, 6, 7, 8 people, many solution sets going on within those large companies. They tend to be spending a lot of tactical time just, working through all the solution sets and making sure that they're on everybody's radar. What about taking a junior AR person, or maybe it's just another AR person within the ranks, and focusing on, find out what pieces within your company somebody's placing a really big bet on. So let's say it's blockchain, or let's say it's some type of digital marketing, or maybe it's a market, maybe it's healthcare. Have that analyst relations person draw up a plan that goes deep and really focuses on that specific best bet, finds out who the analysts are, gets in front of them with the executives, sends them white papers, go really deep in a particular best bet area. And I've seen it happen, and it's paid off in dividends by somebody really focusing and going deep on a place that a company, even a large company, is placing a big bet on. Really, really showcases the analyst relations program.
Okay, great. Thank you, Teri and Duncan. That was super insightful and a great conversation. Today's webinar has been recorded, so if anyone needs to revisit it, it will be available. And we can also send out the slide deck also if anyone would like to revisit those. But thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining us on the Kea Research podcast. Visit www.kearesearch.com for more information on everything we talked about today, as well as free, indispensable information on influencer relations and analyst value. Sign up for our newsletter and receive a free copy of our book, Influencer Relations: Insights on Analyst Value.